It's the summer of 1981, and on his very first morning in Taiwan, Mark is awoken by soldiers training. They're singing army songs, and this military flavor is quite appropriate because Taiwan at the time is quite heavily militarized. I'm John Ross, and today I'm talking with Mark O'Neill about his latest book, The Island, a personal account of Taiwan's extraordinary transformation, published by Earnshaw Books.
The Taiwan History Podcast, Formosa Files, is made possible through the generous sponsorship of the Frank C. Chen Foundation. Formosa Files.
So, Mark, what were you doing in Taiwan?
Well, I decided I needed to learn Mandarin, and Taiwan was a much better place to do that than the mainland. So I had one friend in Taiwan. He lived in Hsinchu. So he kindly put me up when I arrived. So that was the first night I spent, and it was about 5 a.m, and I was awoken by the sound of the military recruits singing. Mm-hmm. And I looked out of the window, and we had a big army base next door, and they were running around the athletics track, and they were singing this song. So, yeah, it was a very good introduction because at that time, Taiwan was a very militarized place and all the young men had to do military service. There were soldiers everywhere. There were posters and propaganda everywhere. So this was the flavor of the time. And
you were living previously in Hong Kong.
Yeah, I was in Hong Kong for 2.5 years. I had a very pleasant experience working for Radio Hong Kong. It was a wonderful introduction to the Chinese world. But I felt I had to improve my skill set. You know, Hong Kong is full of very talented people. Mm-hmm. So you've got to compete with them. You've got to offer them something that they don't have. So at that time, the number of foreigners who learned Mandarin was very few because, you know, China had been closed to the world for 30 years. So I thought if I learned Mandarin, I would have a competitive advantage. And China, of course, had just opened up. So we all thought there would be opportunities there that hadn't existed before.
Yes. And when you came over to study Chinese in Taipei, you were, in fact, learning Chinese from Chinese people. These were mainlanders, I assume.
Yeah. I mean, all the teachers in my school, it was a private school called the Taipei Language Institute. They were all mainlanders. And many of them were children of the hierarchy of the Kuomintang. Mm-hmm. You know, their parents were in the military or in the government. And of course, they spoke Mandarin as their native language, and they were very well educated. So they made for very good teachers. So for us as the students, it was very fortunate because the number in the classes was small. Mm-hmm. So you could have a personal relation with them. And they soon started to tell us about the lives they'd had before they'd come to Taiwan. So we managed to get some understanding of the Kuomintang thinking and, you know, the Kuomintang military and government people and the lives they'd had before 1949.
Quite sad, really. So this is the early 1980s, and they've been in limbo. They've been in exile since around 1949. That's a long time. And I guess they're quite resentful, quite bitter.
Yeah, I think that resentment had disappeared by the time I arrived because it was quite obvious they had a much better life in Taiwan than they would have had if they'd stayed behind. And by now, of course, it was clear that the nationalist government wouldn't be able to recapture the mainland. So that remained the official policy. This was repeated in the newspapers and the propaganda. But of course, they knew that this wasn't going to happen. So Taiwan in the 80s was a good place to live, modern, you know, well-equipped. They had a good quality of life.
Taipei was growing, a bustling city, very lively and safe, although as anywhere, there's always the occasional incident, and you happen to be the victim of one such incident. You were attacked. Can you tell us about that? Yeah,
John, that was a very strange incident. Another British student and I, we were walking near the Taipei railway station. It was maybe 8 o'clock in the evening, and suddenly we were both stabbed in the back. Mm-hmm. And there was a police station nearby, so we sort of hobbled into the police station, and then the police took us to a hospital, which was also nearby. Mm-hmm. And so we lay down on this bed in this big hospital ward. And in those days, there weren't so many nurses, so most of the nurses were family members of the patients. So immediately there was a large crowd around the two beds watching these two monkeys, these two
Yes.
white guys being stitched up. So in the event, John, I was very fortunate. I was stabbed twice, and the nurse said if it had been 1 centimeter further, I would already have gone on my next journey to another place. So it was just stitching, that was all. Nothing else was needed. So after being stitched up, we went back to the hostel where we lived, and we just had to stay stationary for 3 weeks to allow the wound to heal.
Wow. But it says a lot about your personality that didn't sour you on the country. You stayed?
Well, I was lucky. I lived in a hostel. I didn't live in an apartment. So in the hostel, there were mostly Taiwan students and some foreign ones. And the Taiwan students were most solicitous. They were very ashamed that this had happened, especially to a foreigner. So my room was never empty. They came to visit. They brought me tea and biscuits and fruit, and they chatted to me. And I was very, very touched by this. Also, my plan was to learn Mandarin, So if I left Taiwan, that was the end of that plan. So, no, I didn't want to leave. And as I say, I was very touched by people. But the other student, the man who was stabbed with me, he had a different reaction. He had come directly from the UK. He was studying Mandarin, just something new to do. It wasn't part of his long-term plan. So, yeah, he was very shaken up. So after about a month, he decided to leave. So that's understandable.
Mark, any idea why you were stabbed?
Well, the police didn't explain officially, but what Taiwan friends told me is that we were near Zhongshan Gongyuan, which was a pickup point for gays. And many Chinese, as you know, they detest homosexuality and regarded it as a disease brought into Taiwan from the West. So our speculation was that these two people who stabbed us, they were people who were very against homosexuality. They saw us close to Zhongshan Park. They thought we'd gone there to pick up gays or were going there. And so that's why they did it.
Okay. If that was the case, it's certainly very different here today. So while you were studying Mandarin, you decided to get a part-time job. And that was an editing job with a weekly magazine.
Yeah, it was in Lianhebao, United Daily News, and I'm wearing their tie today in honor of this interview. Yeah, so I was very lucky. I studied in the morning, and then after lunch, I cycled to the office of United Daily News, and it was a very big building, and we were on the 4th floor, and they had a weekly economics magazine in English. I assisted with the editing, but that was very useful because nearly all my colleagues were Chinese. I mean, the staff of the UDN was in this building. So I had a lot of opportunities to chat to my colleagues, to my editors, to read what they were doing. So it was a great education in the news in Taiwan and to understand a lot about the country, which I could not have got from sitting in a classroom studying Mandarin.
Yes, and something of a crash course in learning the terms that you can use, which things you shouldn't mention.
Yeah, on the very first day, the editor of our magazine took me into a side room and gave me a list of do's and don'ts. And, for someone who'd been in Hong Kong, this was a learning exercise. The government of China is here in Taipei. The Minister of Foreign Affairs is here in Taipei. So if you refer to mainland China, it's not a government. You have to use quotation marks.
Yeah.
And all this kind of wording. Now, it's exactly the same if you were working in a newspaper in the mainland and you're talking about Taiwan. It's a mirror opposite. That was one thing. Another thing was we can never use the word Taiwanese.
Amazing. Absolutely amazing. Yes. That jumped out from your book when I read that. You couldn't use the word Taiwanese. You couldn't refer to the Taiwanese language.
Now, I didn't understand at the time the reason for this, but as you know, John, there had been great conflict in the 40s and 50s between the Taiwanese and the mainlanders. So we had to refer to the citizens of Taiwan as ROC citizens. We couldn't say they were Taiwanese. So it was okay. I mean, once the editor explained it, he gave me a printed sheet with the instructions. After that, it was very clear, and that's what we did.
Another of these sensitive areas in the media was retaking the mainland. You you had to not criticize it, shall we say?
Yeah, well, this was the official policy. So the newspapers, all the media were under the control of the government. So this policy could not be questioned. But of course, once you'd had a few beers with my colleagues, my editors, your friends, of course, they would say this isn't going to happen. So there was a disconnect between the official policy and what most people thought.
Yes.
Again, that's not unique to Taiwan.
No.
Many countries there is the same situation. So again, it takes a little time. You have to meet people and talk to them, and then you understand what the disconnect is and what to say and what not to say, and what places you can say this and what places you can't say that.
An example of the odd relationship between Taiwan and the mainland at that time were the PLA Air Force defectors, pilots flying jets to Taiwan to get their pile of gold as a reward. I believe there was such a case when you were here.
Yeah, I remember it very well. It was early afternoon. I think it was a Monday or a Tuesday. And our editor said, stop work, look at the television. So there was coverage from Taoyuan Airport, and a PLA jet had just arrived. So we stopped working. Ladies came in with beer cans. Everyone got lots of beer. And we spent the afternoon watching the TV coverage. And the man got out of his jet. He was met by military and civil officials. Joyful commentaries were made by the journalists. But one of my bosses in the magazine was a son of an Air Force commander. So during the afternoon, he said, Mark, things are not quite as they appear. He said, this man will get a lot of money from the government. Yeah, that's true. But he'll never be allowed to fly again. And the government will never trust him. So he'll be given a desk job, probably with quite a good salary. He'll be given an apartment. He'll probably be given a new wife because his mainland wife couldn't come. But he will not be given any job with responsibility, and he won't be allowed to fly again because they don't know what would happen if he got in a plane.
Right, and this was not specific to this chap. It was a standard procedure for these defectors.
Yeah, and I suspect it's the other way around. I'm not sure what the PRC policy is to Taiwan airmen who defect, but I imagine it's the same because, of course, you can't be sure exactly what you're getting. This individual pilot probably is very disappointed because he gets a lot of money, but he's virtually a prisoner here. And I read in some other cases, these people completed their service in the military and then they emigrated. They went to another country because they just felt they couldn't live a free life in Taiwan.
One of the most memorable scenes in your book, The Island, is you're off to post a letter. And
Yeah, I like writing letters. I mean, I still do it today. So yeah, I had my letter. I put the stamp on it. I was walking down a street and I saw a red postbox. So I was putting the letter in the red postbox.
Yeah.
And a man said, no, don't put it in this box. This is for the spying report. Because at this time, if you saw behavior or a person that you were suspicious of, you wrote a report and put it in this red box. I mean, I didn't know that. And he said, no, go down there. There's the post office postbox. So I thank him. Otherwise, I'd have lost the letter. So, that was part of the ambience at the time. People were trained to be suspicious of others and to watch out. And if they saw something, then make a report and put it in these red boxes.
Interesting. So you left Taiwan in 1983?
Yes, I had a very enjoyable time. I was very happy with my teachers and the learning environment. And I did some freelance articles. And I was looking for a full-time job in the media, so I applied for Reuters, and I was lucky to be hired by them. And they very much needed people who had some knowledge of Mandarin, so I was very lucky. I was able to work with them, and they wanted people in Hong Kong, so I had to move to Hong Kong again.
And after decades of journalism, you turned to being a full-time writer. And my goodness, you have like a library of books you've written in the last 20 years. I've read a few of them.
Well, let me tell you how I became an author. This is to do with Taiwan as well. So in 2006, I was working in Shanghai for the South China Morning Post. And during a visit to Hong Kong to meet our editors, I met an American journalist friend, and he'd been hired by the Tzu Chi Foundation in Taiwan to write a book about them. But he explained to me that because of his family reasons, he had to leave Hong Kong and move back to the US. And would I like to write this book? So I knew nothing about the Tzu Chi Foundation. So in those days, there was no direct flights. So you had to fly from Shanghai to Hong Kong or Macau and then fly to Taiwan. So I flew to Taiwan and I went to Hualien, which is the headquarters. And I met their staff. And then, of course, I met Master Zheng Yan. And about 5 minutes with Master Zheng Yan was enough to convince me to give up my job in Shanghai and write a book about the foundation, because she was clearly an extraordinary individual. So the opportunity to write about her and her organization, I thought was very, very precious. So that's what I did. So that's how I started writing books.
Lovely book. I've read it.
At this moment, I'm doing a revision, because in February at the Taipei Book Fair, I met Ray He, who's executive vice president now, and he was in charge of me for the writing of the book. And he said we should write an update, because since it was published, the foundation has expanded to more than 100 countries in the world. So many things have happened. So that's what I'm doing at the moment. I'm doing a rewrite, and it's really extraordinary what the foundation has done and how many new countries it's done. In Mozambique, for example, it's building 18 secondary schools.
Wonderful, wonderful.
In Mozambique, there are almost no Taiwanese, almost no Buddhists. I mean, there's no connection with Taiwan or Buddhism, but the foundation has expanded to the point that they can take on such projects.
You've also written a lovely book on Jiang Jingguo's Russian wife, or actually from Belarus. What's that one called? China's Russian princess?
Princess, yes. When I was in Taiwan, Jiang Jingguo was the president, so we saw him all the time on the television, newspapers, posters, and so on. But we never saw his wife. So I asked my Taiwan friends, is he married? Oh, yes, he's married. Does he have a wife? Oh, yes, he has a wife, and she's a foreign wife. Where does she come from? Well, there are a lot of guesses about this. One person said she belonged to the family of the Tsar Nicholas. But anyway, she was kept from public view. So she sort of always remained in my mind, this rather mystery person. So later on, when I had more time, I thought, well, let's do a book about her. And I suppose I was inspired by the fact that she was a mystery, so very little was known about her. That's what inspired me to do it.
Excellent. And you've written a book on the National Palace Museum. Well, I should say museums, because the one in Beijing, you cover that, and the one in Taipei.
Well, let me tell you how that came about. I was doing an article for a magazine in Macau about the National Palace Museum in Taipei. And for that, I had to interview the director, Madame Zhou Kongxin. And she's an extremely elegant lady. And she receives visitors in this wonderful room, which is full of Chinese art treasures. So you're hypnotized by the art treasures. You're hypnotized by her. And then she explains how these items arrived in Taiwan. Well, I mean, most people in Taiwan know that, but a lot of us don't know that. So when she explained that it had taken 16 years to get from Beijing to Taiwan in the middle of a war with Japan and then a civil war, and the pieces were not damaged or destroyed or stolen, I thought I must write a book about this. This is so extraordinary. The next day I went to they have a library, and I went to the library, and another beautiful Chinese lady came out with her hand full of folders. She came over to me. She said, "Oh, Mr. O'Neill, I think you'll need these for your book." So she handed me all this material, which is exactly what I needed for the book. You know, official reports, biographies of the officials, of the museum staff, and so forth. Yeah, that was a wonderful book to write.
Oh, spoiled for material there from the very beginnings of the collection in the Forbidden City. You know, the pieces themselves are magnificent. And then, yes, you have the end of dynastic China, and then the war and their journey here.
So, of course, Joe, we also went to Beijing. We also interviewed staff from the Palace Museum. And I visited the Palace Museum of Beijing often, so I was quite familiar with it. So so the book is about both.
Yes.
But the main story is actually how the pieces left Beijing and came to Taiwan. So that's the main narrative.
While you were reporting on Taiwan, I guess you came here to cover elections. And while you're writing these books, you're witnessing Taiwan's transformation. This is the subtitle of your book, of course, a personal account of Taiwan's extraordinary transformation.
Yeah, John, I was very fortunate because as a journalist, I was sent to Taiwan regularly to cover elections, or I was sent just after the Hong Kong handover. So it's July 1997. So me and a lot of other foreign journalists were invited by the Taiwan government, and they were giving their response to one country, two systems. Yeah, I was able to visit the island regularly, see my friends there, and this enables you to sort of keep you up to date with what's going on. And then we have the 2000 election. So I was there for that, and that was extremely dramatic.
Yes.
If I can give you two cameos,
yes.
What I remember. I went to Tainan to interview the mother of Chen Shui-bian. And she lived in a very modest one-story home. She didn't speak Mandarin, so we had to have a DPP interpreter. And she explained that her son was born. He was very, very weak baby, and his name was Chen Bian. So she took the baby to the local temple, and a nun there said he lacked water. So she must add water to his name. So he became Chen Shui-bian. So with the adding of the water, his health greatly improved. And then she described that they were a very poor family. Her husband was a landless farmer. He was just a day laborer. And her son went to school without shoes on and so on. It was very inspiring how a child from such a household can become the head of a party and be the presidential candidate. And as you know, he won the presidency with a minority of the votes. I think he got about 37%. So
yes, so it's a wonderful fairy tale. Well, it's a wonderful story, but people often forget it was actually the spoiler, James Song, who probably gave him victory.
No, there's no question that's the reason. And it was all about the personal ambition of one person. That's James Song. He felt he should have been the KMT candidate and he wasn't. And so he ran on his own, and he's popular. He got a lot of votes and split the KMT vote. And I just remember when the results came out, the streets of Taipei were so dramatic. I met people, I remember an engineer in his 50s, and he was weeping. And I said, why are you weeping? He said, because I could never imagine that we Taiwanese, we have our own president from our own party. I could never imagine this, and now we have it. And then I walked along a little way, and I went to a restaurant, and this was must have been a KMT restaurant. And the people there said, this is so unfair. You know, this guy gets 36% of the vote. Our people got more than 60%. You know, there should be a runoff. The top KMT candidate than him. But that's not the rule. It was very dramatic from all aspects.
All right. Thanks, Mark. It's fun talking to you.
Me and the publisher are extremely grateful to you for taking the time.